Magnus Carlsen is undoubtedly one of the greatest chess players of all time. So great, in fact, that he once beat a Grandmaster while drunk. How did this even happen? Let's break it down. The victim of this game, Damien Ribière, begins with pawn e4. Magnus opens in response with pawn c5, initiating the Sicilian defense. Damien moves his pawn to a3, followed by a pawn to g6. A few moves later, and Damien's bishop shifts to a2, which is a fairly simple choice. Magnus moves his knight to e7, followed by white pawn h4, which everyone in the room finds quite amusing, including Magnus. A few pawns are traded quickly, and black pawn d6 causes Damien to move his knight to f3. This move allows Damien to castle if he wishes to. Due to Magnus being drunk, he responds with a bad move, pawn a6. Damien capitalizes on Magnus's error by castling. A few more moves are made and Magnus castles queenside. This move was hard for Magnus to make, considering he couldn't properly control his hands due to drinking. Magnus is under circumstances where he's vulnerable to mistakes. Keeping this in mind, Damien moves his knight to d1. This puts the knight in a much better position. Magnus pushes his pawn to e5, threatening the f4 bishop. To keep it safe, Damien has the bishop fall back to g3. Still on the attack, Magnus moves his pawn to f5. The following move of bishop h4 pins Magnus's knight to his rook. Magnus makes a clever but simple move of rook to f8. This makes the opposing bishop ineffective. Damien pushes his knight out to e3, which allows Magnus to build a strong pawn chain with the next move. After white knight d5, a trade occurs. Magnus's bishop shoots over to f6, which intensifies the pace of the match. Damien, with little options at the moment, chooses to advance his pawn to b4. Magnus brings his knight over to e7, followed by white bishop b3. After black king b8, Damien decides to advance his pawn again to c3. Things change after Magnus moves his bishop to g4, which leads to Damien setting off a trade. Damien then moves his pawn to d4, which triggers a trade of pawns. The idea behind this move is to open up his queen to attack Magnus's rooks. Magnus, with his incredible yet drunk mind, quickly captures one of the pawns, closing out any chances that plan would bring. More pawns are traded, and Damien sets his rook up to attack Magnus's queen. Magnus responds by checking Damien with the queen. Of course, Damien blocks the check with his rook. However, Magnus makes a huge blunder, rook to d8. This move erases the advantage Magnus had gained, leaving Damien in an opportunistic position. Damien moves his queen to c3, posing a dangerous threat to Magnus's pawn. Magnus makes another mistake by allowing this, instead capturing the knight. Damien checks him, allowing white rook to capture on f3. A trade of queens then occurs, and both players find themselves in a neutral position. Magnus has extreme confidence despite all of this due to excelling at endgames. Magnus attacks the rook and Damien pushes it away. He ends up making another mistake by playing pawn f3. Damien exploits this with bishop d5, putting black king in trouble. Damien is clearly in the dominant position right now. Magnus moves his king to b8. Doing anything he can to stay in the game. Damien checks Magnus's king, all while stealing a pawn. White rook goes to h7, trying to capture another pawn. Using the brain that has obtained him such a legendary status, Magnus comes up with an idea to threaten Damien. He chooses to move his rook to g6, which Damien responds to with pawn g3. With a plan in motion, Magnus moves his rook to f8, attempting to check Damien's king with more pawn movement. Damien moves his own rook to a7, trying to also check. Magnus pushes his rook down to f6, followed by rook h5. The black pawn advances to f2, causing a check. Magnus takes a pawn right after that as well, gaining momentum again. Despite having the opportunity to forever check Magnus with rook a8, he instead chooses rook h1. Magnus is now in a position to win the game despite every setback and blunder. Black knight moves to g4 as white king shifts to e2. Looking to close in on the kill, Magnus checks with rook e3. This allows Magnus to promote his pawn to a queen, essentially ending the game. Both players shake hands as the crowd around Magnus erupts in cheer. Despite being drunk and making critical errors, Magnus Carlsen continues to grow his legacy as potentially the greatest chess player of all time.